So by now I hope you have a good understanding of the general process and the different pieces that we need to string together to get QoS working in a Juniper environment. Now keep in mind, many of these things that we're configuring here, even though it's on a Juniper device, still apply and they're still relevant to the other vendors. They might have slightly different names, but at the end of the day, all of these pieces are still required to get things up and running. So I'm not going to spend much time in this video explaining each little piece in detail. Rather, I had you go out and look at that yourselves. So what I want to do here is just walk through a really basic Juniper QoS configuration, talk about some of those quick high points as we go through it, and set you up to go do some more of this per applications or different interests that you have in your network. We're going to jump right into things here. I'm going to create a quick commit so I have a starting point. If I mess things up completely, I want to be able to get back to where I started here. So let's go into configure mode and let's just do a quick commit. And I'm going to do a commit that says before beginning QoS. We forgot our keyword comment, so commit comment. And there we go. So we've got our commit comment before beginning QoS, and we're ready to start things. One of the first things that we're going to want to do is configure some different bandwidth queues, and we're going to call those forwarding classes in Juniper. Now, a couple things to remember here. We have a couple different forwarding classes that we can see. We should be able to do a show, class of service, forwarding classes. We don't have any actually configured right now. If I exit out of this and run the same command, you'll see what already exists. So if I do a show, class of service, forwarding classes, we're going to see, and my text is wrapping a little bit, so it's not very easy to see on my screen, but we have 4 default forwarding classes, 0, 1, 2, 3, those are our queue numbers, and we have these defaults that Juniper recommends we don't change unless there's a specific reason to. Reason being, if we're doing behavior aggregate, QoS, some of these might be already predefined by a previous device. So an upstream peer might send traffic through us using one of these as their queue. Their traffic is tagged for it, so we could just grab that traffic very nicely. On this particular device, I have 8 possible queues that I can use. I can make 32 forwarding classes total. Those 32 forwarding classes would need to be mapped to one of the 8 queues, so we have about a 4-to-1 ratio that we could make. Now, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense because if you have multiple forwarding classes pointing to the same queue, they're really all going to operate the same way. The queue is what's going to define how that traffic flows through the network. My recommendation is keep it simple, use the 8 forwarding classes, or the 8 queues rather, and then we'll assign forwarding classes to those as appropriate. So I'm going to jump back into my configure mode, and we're going to create a couple of bandwidth queues. Now I'm going to use some pretty large queues here, or pretty different queues. That way it's easier for us to see how this traffic is flowing through. What I want to do is create a couple of class of service forwarding queues. First things we're going to do is we're going to go into Edit, Class of Service, Forwarding Classes. From the Forwarding Classes menu, I'm going to set up queues. So we're going to do set queue number 4, because 0 through 3 are already predefined for us. So set queue 4, and we're just going to give it a name. I'm going to call this bandwidth, and I'll say maybe 20 megabytes. So any traffic assigned to this forwarding class should reside under 20 megabytes or megabits of bandwidth. I'm also going to create one that's going to be vastly slower so we can actually see the difference in how QoS is working. I'm going to do a set queue. We're going to make queue number 5 super slow. So let's make it fun. We'll kind of take a trip back in time and go back to 56K. So it'll almost be like a dial-up simulator. Kind of fun to test with. So those are the forwarding classes. Really, they're kind of arbitrary. We could name them for anything. They could be specific applications. They could be bandwidth like we have now. It's just a name to classify some traffic. They're not really doing anything for us yet. Where we start to actually make them do things is when we introduce a scheduler. The schedulers are going to allow us to actually limit the traffic to those 20 meg and 56K bandwidth caps. Let's go into those. I'm going to hit up, so I'm still remaining in class of service, but this time I'm going to do edit schedulers. So from edit schedulers, I'm going to create a couple of schedulers to limit our traffic to the specified bandwidth we've given them. I'm going to say set scheduler. Oops, we can actually just give it the name since we're already in scheduler. So we'll do set scheduler. I'm just going to make these match 20 megabytes. Transmit rate, we'll do 20 M. So it wants your transmit rate in bits. If you just put the M there, it'll convert that to megabits for you. I'm also going to make this scheduler be exact. We'll talk about that here in a second. So we're going to do set scheduler 20 megabit exact. We need transmit rate exact. There we go. So what that is doing is we are basically creating a single rate two-color policer. They have a single rate of bandwidth that they can use. They cannot exceed it. So their traffic is either under 20 megabits per second or it's over. Now this is where we could get more complex with those different policing policies, where we could do a single rate tricolor or double rate tricolor. We're keeping it simple for now, but something you should be aware of, that's what we're doing, is we're just limiting this to the exact bandwidth it has. I need to create a scheduler for my 56K traffic as well. I'm going to do set scheduler. We're going to call this 56 kilobits. Set the transmit rate to 56. We'll do a K here instead. And let's make sure this is also exact. We don't want to allow it to exceed 56K for our particular example. So we've got our forwarding class, we've got our scheduler, and now we need to tie them together. Where we start to tie them together is when we introduce a scheduler map. All this does is ties a forwarding class to a scheduler, so giving that meaningless name as a forwarding class an actual hard limit behind it. I'm going to hit up here, so I'll just go back up one level in my configuration, and we're going to do edit scheduler maps. I'm going to call this map bandwidth limit, and we'll do forwarding class. So saving ourselves some typing by getting into this a little bit. We may have to stop at bandwidth limit. There we go. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a set forwarding class, and I'm going to pick the forwarding class I've already made. So this was bandwidth, and this was, let's start with our 20 megabit. So bandwidth 20 megabit, and from here we're going to map it to a scheduler. So we'll say scheduler, and we can tab complete this out to be scheduler 20 megabit. So we just tied those two pieces together with that command. Next thing we're going to do, tie the 56K forwarding class to the 56K scheduler. Same commands here. Set forwarding class, bandwidth, 56K, scheduler. We'll do our scheduler for 56K here. And there we go. So we've tied those two things together. The next thing I want to do is figure out how are we classifying this traffic. We're going to make kind of a mixed model here. I'm going to do this based on interface-based classification, so any traffic coming into a specific interface will be run through these policies. But I'm also wanting to limit just specific types of traffic. So I'm also going to do some multi-field classification. First, let's tackle the interface-based classification here. So it's going to be in two parts. We're going to have this split out over a series of commands, but we'll get the first part put into here for now. I'm going to go up a couple of times. So I want to be back in the edit class of service, and we're going to do edit interfaces. And we're working with our GE000 unit 0. So that's our WAN interface in this example. I'm going to tell it which scheduler map to use. So I'm going to do set scheduler map. We called ours bandwidth limit. The other thing I can do is I can set a shaping rate for this interface. What the shaping rate is going to do for me is this is going to allow me to limit a hard limit regardless of how many forwarding classes I have on this interface to a very hard limit. So if I do set shaping rate and I say 25 megabit, or 25M rather, what this is going to do is this is going to limit any traffic flowing through that interface to 25 megabits. So regardless of how much traffic we have going, this interface should never pump out more than that. We're going to exit out of this, so go all the way up to top and create our multi-field classification. Now in multi-field classification, I might want to limit traffic coming in and going out, so bi-directional here. So I'm going to create a bunch of firewall filters here, and we're going to assign that traffic that matches those coming through this gig Ethernet 0 interface to those forwarding classes. So we're not just blindly taking any traffic coming through and limiting its bandwidth. We're going to look at which ports and protocols it's using and then choose whether or not we want to limit bandwidth based off of those. So what I'm doing here is I'm just going to use a basic firewall construct, and we're going to use these as our classification. What I'm going to do is I'm going to get into the Edit, Firewall, Family INET, so we're just dealing with IPv4 rules here, creating a filter called Bandwidth Input, and I'm going to start with term 0. That's my first firewall rule. What I want to do is I want to set any traffic, and this is where I start to identify which traffic should be policed. I'm going to say maybe I want traffic from source port. We can do source port 80. We could also do set from source port 21. We'll say maybe anything coming in on 80 or 21, we can allow this to have the 20 meg, so that faster set of bandwidth. To do that, we'll just do a set, then count, input 20 meg. Tell it which forwarding class it should go to. So if we're going to exceed that 20 meg, we need to put it in a forwarding class here, and then we can sort of rate limit it. So I'm going to do set, then forwarding class, bandwidth 20 megabytes. So after we classify it, put it in that forwarding class, the last thing I need to do is accept the traffic. So we're not blocking it or anything like that. We just need to tell the firewall to allow it through. So do a set, then accept. I want to put everything else, so if it did not match these rules to get the high priority fast bandwidth, I'm going to put everything else in the slow 56K bandwidth. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go up a level. I'm going to do edit term 1, so my second firewall rule will live at term 1. And we're just going to say everything else is going to be limited to 56K. So I'm going to say set then count 56K. Rather, we need to do input 56K. We'll do a set then forwarding class. We're going to set this to the bandwidth 56K forwarding class. And then lastly, we need to accept that traffic. Now, what we can do is we can just go up a level, and I can do a show here, and this will show you the firewall constructs that we just created. So there we have it. Term 0 is that first rule. We're saying if it's from ports 80 or 21, so just normal web or FTP, it's allowed to have that 20 meg bandwidth. It's also going to be run through our 20 meg forwarding class, which is also tied to that scheduler. Term 1, we're saying anything else, you get 56K. If we're going to exceed that, we're going to put you in the 56K forwarding class. Those are tied to those scheduler maps. Scheduler map ties us to the scheduler, which then gives us the hard limit of bandwidth. So there's kind of a lot of pieces here. It might be a little bit confusing just to hear about, but if you go through the configurations and take a look at this stuff, it's really not too bad. There's just 3 main pieces we're working with. After that, we're just classifying traffic into those. That was for the inbound traffic. I also want to create these firewall filters for outbound traffic. So we're going to police this traffic coming in and going out of that interface. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to go up one more level, and we're going to set up a bandwidth output rule. I might need to do, let's see, set, we'll do a filter, bandwidth, output. So just going the other direction. And get ahead of myself here a little bit, we need to get into the edit mode. There we go. So edit firewall family iNet filter bandwidth output. Same thing's happening here. We're going to create basically the exact same firewall rules, only instead of source ports, there'll be destination ports. So just going that other direction. So we'll go through this a little bit quicker this time. I want to do a set. Let's work on our term 0 so we can actually go into edit term 0, that first rule. We'll do a set from destination port, and we said ports 80 and port 21. We're going to give it our bandwidth cap, so set, then count. Instead of doing input this time, we'll do output 20 meg. Put it in our forwarding class, so set, then forwarding class, bandwidth 20 meg, set, then accept. Okay, so we looked at ports 80 and 21. Those are going output now instead of input. They're still going to get policed with our bandwidth 20 meg forwarding class. I need to classify everything else as 56K traffic still. I'm going to go up a level in the configuration, do edit term 1, and we can just go through these same rules we did before here. So we're going to go set, then count, output 56K, set, then forwarding class, bandwidth 56K, set, then accept. Perfect. I'm going to go back up to my top level here, and we can just take a look at a couple things going through this. If I type show, it's going to show me all of the new configuration I would have if I committed this right now. So let's walk through it. So as you can see here, we just have the basic configuration of our interfaces, the services we're allowing through this firewall, nothing that really has anything to do with our QoS quite yet. Scrolling down a little bit, we can see our two interfaces that we have here. So our WAN interface, the LAN interface, and we start getting into the interesting QoS things. Under class of service, I made the two forwarding classes assigned to a queue. Those were nothing more than names matching a queue. And each of those queues is where we can apply the bandwidth limitations to those. Now you'll see I have a warning here because we haven't finished our configuration. So if I was going to try to commit this, we're missing the per unit scheduler configuration. We'll come to this here in just a second. When we scroll down a little bit more, I see on gig Ethernet 000 unit 0, I'm tying this to a scheduler map called bandwidth limit. Bandwidth limit assigns our forwarding classes down here to specific, basically these are tied to the scheduler maps. And here we can see the specific bandwidth that those are given. So we have a forwarding class which has a queue, a scheduler which limits our bandwidth, and the scheduler map which ties it all together, and lastly our interface belongs to that scheduler map. If we keep going down, just scrolling past some of this, right near the bottom we see those rules that we just made. I created a bandwidth input filter, so anything coming into this interface, we're going to look at the ports, figure out what it should be assigned to, and we also have our bandwidth output. Now these two filters are the exact same, so we're filtering bandwidth input and output the same way. Next thing I'm going to do is tie those filters to my gig Ethernet 000 interface. So I'm going to go into Edit Interfaces, GE000, and I'm going to say per unit, I'll do set per unit scheduler. What this does is, since I'm using a sub interface of unit 0, this scheduler is going to apply to all of those sub interfaces. Very common thing that we're going to do. So by default, we're probably going to just say set per unit scheduler. I also need to apply those input and output filters so we can look at the traffic for multi-field classification and then run them through our forwarding classes here. So we're going to do set interfaces. We're actually already in there, so we'll do a set family And let's see, we need to go to edit unit 0. And we can actually just type this out, family inet filter. We're going to do set input. This would be our bandwidth input filter. Do set output, and this will be bandwidth output. Perfect. Let's do a commit, add a comment that says after QoS configuration. Hopefully everything checks out and we should be good. Excellent. So what we've set up now, and I'll show you guys some ways that we can actually start to test this in a different video, is we have bandwidth being filtered. Anything coming in or out of gig Ethernet 000 on unit 0 will be allowed 20 megabytes or megabits per second if it's on ports 20 or 80. Everything else coming in or out of that interface will be limited to 56K. So just a very basic QoS setup, but I hope that gives you some idea of what pieces we need and how that's all tied together.